Hello, let's get started. We want to give Mark and Kristen as much time, as much of this hour as possible. I'm Stephen Best, director of the Townsend Center. We're pleased to host Mark Goble today. Mark's professor in the English department and the author of Beautiful Circuits, Modernism and the Mediated Life, and he's here today to discuss his newest book, Downtime, the 20th Century in Slow Motion. Both of the books were published by, have been published by Columbia University Press. Joining Mark today is Kristen Wissel, professor in the Department of Film and Media. Two forthcoming events I want to mention. Tomorrow, October 30th, we will be hosting a symposium on the drawings around you on display in this room. The drawings from Patrick Chambone's 2024 graphic novel, Michel Foucault, Histoire du Folie. Patrick will be joined by Lynn Huffer, professor of philosophy at Emory University and author of 3 books on Foucault's Ethics of Eros, and our own James Porter, the Irving Stone Professor in Literature and Distinguished Professor in Rhetoric. And that event will take place in this room, of course, at 5, and it'll be followed by a reception in the Townsend Center lobby and a sort of general opening for the exhibition. Our next book chat will be held on Wednesday, November 5th. That's next Wednesday. Nathaniel Wolfson will discuss his new book, Concrete Encoded, Poetry, Design, and the Cybernetic Imaginary in Brazil. And Nathaniel will be in conversation with wait for it, Mark Goble. So Mark and Kristen, the stage is yours. Thanks.
So welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I just want to begin by saying congratulations on the book. It's really fabulous. It's a fascinating read, and I feel like I learned so much about slow motion from reading it. I think it makes it just a really important contribution to this kind of growing body of scholarship on special and visual effects. Just to start off, your book provides a fascinating and expansive diachronic and synchronic study that excavates a history of slow motion, beginning with its emergence as a minor aesthetic form in the early part of the 20th century, to its development by the century's end into a radically ubiquitous visual effect that proliferates across media. So can you begin just by describing the historical arc of slow motion's more significant appearances and disappearances across the 20th century before 1968?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will be leaving in the week in between this one and the next one, so you won't be able to find me here all the time. One of the things that I started to figure out when I started to think about slow motion for the book was figuring out trying to decide when it started. So on the one hand, I remembered, not directly remembered, but remembered 1968, Bonnie and Clyde was the earliest slow motion film I could remember seeing, then trying to reverse engineer where it came from. And then realizing that its history, on the one hand, its history is distributed and coextensive with really the history of film, from the earliest moments of pre-cinema, early cinema. There's examples of slow motion. Examples of slow motion in my mic on too. Examples of slow motion in the 1890s, 1900s. Then clearly some more memorable examples from the modernist period, experimental filmmakers that I'm sure many of you will know. Buñuel, Cocteau, usual suspects in a kind of avant-garde tradition. I think what the other significant early appearance, and then I'll talk about some maybe disappearances too, is realizing how early some of the non-narrative forms of slow motion that we see all the time today too, from scientific filmmaking to sports highlights, are already relatively firmly established in the silent era. In the 1920s, you have shorts of Harold Abrams running in super slow motion from the Olympics. So you see sports, you see these non-narrative uses of slow motion early, and then where it starts to disappear or maybe appear belatedly is sort of thinking about if all of these ways in which slow motion that we would see now, or that are so familiar, are kind of already there, just ready to go, or 1925, 1932, right? So why was it not until 1968 that we sort of see sort of narrative fiction film in the kind of sort of mainstream way, sort of using slow motion so much and so frequently that it becomes sort of omnipresent. And so that sort of the mid-century, sort of thinking about where it sort of takes longer than it might, or it doesn't appear as sort of soon as you might think, sort of realizing that Hollywood film doesn't have a lot of use for it, until some other things happen later in the 60s, so we can talk about. And that even some of the places where I expected to find more slow motion than I remembered, just assuming that I hadn't, because like everyone, I haven't watched everything. But I assume that, clearly, there must be, the French New Wave will have more slow motion than I remember. I just haven't watched it, or there'll be, and there's actually less of that, and almost none, in fact. And so thinking about that sort of delayed effect of why you do have to wait as long as you do to get slow motion. So the way that it doesn't appear in a lot of films from that sort of mid-century or European art cinema moment that are very much interested in the experience of time and nonlinear time and breaking up the chronology of continuity editing, but slow motion as a special effect isn't really of that much use to them. And so trying to sort of then figure out why, or at least speculating about why we wait for it, was one of the things that one of the things I was trying to come to an answer for.
Great, thank you. So throughout the book, slow motion emerges as both a technology of speed, and you sort of notice there's a kind of inverse relationship. The slower the image, the faster the camera is, the frame rate the camera is sort of filming. And in addition to being a technology of speed, it emerges as a kind of symbolic form that addresses the experience of modernity, the culture of time and space, and especially capitalism's accelerated and sometimes lagging temporalities. So can you talk about slow motion's peculiar registration of capitalism's regime of speed, and perhaps conclude by elaborating upon what you call slow motion's, quote, valorization of movement?
Yeah. So one of the things that I sort of started thinking about when I started working on this book, maybe 10, 12 years ago, especially in Berkeley, center of slow food, slow fashion, slow travel, that there's a kind of common sense linking of slowness as somehow being antagonistic towards, or high-speed capitals, which at some level it is, right? The values sort of around those movements are, and then sort of thinking, could slow motion, what is slow motion's relationship to sort of these other forms of slowness that aestheticize slowness or sort of valorize slowness, to literally putting value on it, whether it's an aesthetic value, a philosophical value. And then thinking again about that sort of paradox that Kristen sort of mentioned too, that you get slow motion by speeding something else up, a sort of speed that you don't see, but the camera has to produce, so that the slower the motion, something's always moving faster. And then when you get finally to the era of digital effects, it's sort of infinitely fast. It's not even sort of mechanical analog photography anymore. So that slow motion doesn't necessarily reject speed or deny speed. It sort of displaces it, or it transmutes it, or it symbolizes it in some different way. And then sort of linking that to obviously the fact that slow motion comes to distinguish, or comes to, especially now, sort of blockbuster filmmaking. So the genres in which slow motion is the most familiar are not sort of experimental art films anymore. It's the Marvel Cinematic Universe and everything else at a certain sort of cost. So that slow motion both becomes a special effect that's sort of drawn into, big budget filmmaking, but that it also still sort of captures that sense of sort of everyday life for a lot of people, where you're sort of being asked to sort of speed up and slow down at the same time. And then here's where the kind of logic of valorization sort of went back, and reading some of the classic accounts of sort of turnover rate in Marx's Capital and sort of other accounts of speeding up assembly lines as a way of sort of extracting more profit out of sort of every hour of the working day, every minute, every second, that kind of acceleration of work processes that are so much a part of sort of everyday sort of life. And then how that sort of experience of having to move faster through all sorts of individual sort of micro intervals of your day also then produces this kind of weird slow motion effect that I've been very quickly doing the same thing for a long time now, or I've been writing hundreds of emails one after the other for hours. And so a way in which that sort of treadmill effect that the Marxist economist Moishe Postone talks about, this sort of sense of contemporary capitalism makes us feel like we are moving faster, but not really moving anywhere in sort of historical, or, in historical time, or even in sort of social space. That slow motion became a sort of figure for that. That somehow that sort of relationship between fast and slow technologically did sort of have some resonances in thinking about the sociology of time, the economics of time, and really just the kind of lived experience of time. Probably no accident that I was writing. I did a lot of the writing of this book in COVID time, sort of stuck in place day after day, but sort of you can chew up a lot of time doing nothing day after day.
Thank you. So the last part of your book focuses on the insurgent year of 1968, which sees the emergence of some of the most aesthetically significant and recognizable uses of technologically decelerated motion in the history of cinema. And you know that Bonnie and Clyde is the film that really sort of begins what you see as this sudden acceleration in the use of slow motion at the end of the 20th century. So can you begin by accounting for 1968 as the turning point in the history of this special effect? And then this is going to be a three-part question.
Okay.
Then can you elaborate on your argument that slow motion and Bonnie and Clyde emblematizes, quote, history in crisis? And then after that, you talk about 2001 as well, and you argue that it registers the violence of technological progress. So maybe just sort of discuss.
Okay. Yeah. Well, one thing about sort of 1968, when I, again, sort of intuitively sort of tried to remember slow motion, and Bonnie and Clyde was what I started with, that instantly sort of get drawn into the way slow motion at the end of Bonnie and Clyde, especially, sort of starts to figure as the kind of coming out or the introduction of new Hollywood, new American cinema. Really sort of establishes this new periodization within the sort of aesthetics and to some extent the social history and even kind of corporate organization of Hollywood. So one way of thinking about why 1968 in quotes to really sort of represent a period that for the films I'm interested in the last section of the book really are overlapping production histories that go from 1966 all the way to 70, but they're all kind of films of 68 in a kind of mythological sense. There's some internal, there's some fairly sort of internal reasons. As Hollywood is trying to sort of cater to a youth market of the time, pushing up against the limits of the Hays Code and prior ways in which censorship was enacted on films. There's certain things that slow motion's really good at showing, that prior to the mid to late 60s, you just couldn't get in a big budget mainstream Hollywood film anyway, like being shot 400 times and having blood splatter everywhere. That's going to be censored. So there's some internal dynamics within sort of studio filmmaking and sort of the larger kind of culture of looking for more explicit material catering to a youth market that has a taste for, there's supposed to have a taste for more explicit material. And then sort of seeing how sort of readily a filmmaker like Arthur Penn, especially when he's doing press for Bonnie and Clyde, really runs with this sort of, he wants to make it as symbolic as possible. So he will give interviews where, why not show this kind of violence when you see this kind of violence on TV news coverage of the Tet Offensive, and then sort of goes on, when this is the kind of violence that has always defined sort of America's sort of modern histories of what we call progress, which is really just a sort of nonstop history of violence, going back to the JFK assassination, and then the violence of the civil rights era, the Red Scare, et cetera. There's all that what's now just kind of coming out is a sort of violence that's always been there, and now it can be graphically registered. And he sort of makes it part of this sort of period moment for 1968, very emblematically, and a sort of term that I actually take from Kristen, and sort of thinking about how a slow motion, how a special effect doesn't necessarily sort of allegorize directly, although Arthur Penn comes very close to basically saying you're just watching sort of an allegory of Vietnam or in Bonnie and Clyde, but other filmmakers of the period to try and think about how slow motion becomes emblematic, sort of becomes a kind of aesthetic, symbolic sort of form that can sort of speak to a sort of historical moment, maybe not directly, but is kind of catalyzing it. And so you see, that's one thing that you see in a lot of sort of films of 68, 68, that sort of capturing a sort of period sort of moment, and then different ways in which slow motion sort of allows a kind of new film style to kind of coalesce as a sort of stylistic identity. And so in that way, you could maybe think about slow motion sort of generationally for a bunch of filmmakers, the way you would think of rack zooms or lens flares or a lot of other kind of aesthetic tics of filmmaking at this time. But that slow motion, sort of, because it finally is about sort of how time passes, and then ends up in a bunch of films like Bonnie and Clyde and Once Upon a Time in the West and 2001 that are themselves about sort of long historical expanses. It maybe has a little more sort of traction in thinking about that sort of 60s moment than, I can fetishize anything, but I don't think I could really make lens flares that important. Give me a while, I'd try. But that's where slow motion sort of works in that way, because it's actually thinking about whether time is moving fast or slow, whether 1968 just happened, or it's actually just a sort of slight sort of phase shift in from a kind of historical trajectory that's been going on for decades. And then 2001 may be the ultimate sort of version of this, where someone like Kubrick, 4 million years of human history is basically the same story, just inventing something to kill someone or kill something. First there were bones, now there were bombs. It's all the same story. So it's 4 million years that slow motion can sort of draw out in these kind of grand effects. But it's also just the same thing. Have we advanced in time at all? Aren't we all still just sort of cavemen looking for a bigger bone? And so it's that sort of that a very kind of Kubrickian sort of irony around sort of whether time really moves at all.
Do you want to?
Yeah. So I'm sure many of you will know this clip, but this is the end of Bonnie and Clyde, which for the record is not actually the first slow motion in Bonnie and Clyde. There's a brief sequence about halfway through the film of a couple of kids sort of playing cops and robbers, sort of kind of ironic anticipation of the sort of violence that we see here. And that's actually the first slow motion, which I didn't remember that from watching Bonnie and Clyde until I went back and rewatched it. But this is the big finale. This is the slow motion that Pauline Kael and sort of critics of the period then sort of take as this sort of signature sort of emergence of what slow motion does. There's a few more seconds of quiet aftermath, but that's the show.
And you mentioned in the book that Penn was referencing John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, I won't try and find the clip, but some of you maybe spotted or know this. One of the first shots of Warren Beatty in slow motion, you actually see a little skull fragment flying off, which was Penn sort of cites that as a direct homage to Zapruder frame. I can't remember the frame number, but it's recently just been sort of published, sort of in Time magazine. So there's a sort of, again, trying to get the Kennedy assassination into Bonnie and Clyde to again kind of have this one sort of scene of violence sort of represent or sort of encode sort of a decade of violence.
Okay, so throughout the book, slow motion becomes inseparable from the relentless pace of progress and change that you've already described. And you provide a kind of fascinating analysis of the racial politics of speed. So can you talk a little bit about Julie Dash's use of slow motion in Daughters of the Dust to visualize a modernity defined by, quote, delays, distensions, and deliberate retardations?
So Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, I'm sure a film that a lot of you know, a sort of a story about sort of the Gullah, sort of a Gullah, a group of sort of Gullah family that's sort of living on a sort of oasis from the modern world, sort of at the turn of the 20th century. But now the family's going to be moving to the mainland, so it's to some extent a sort of a piece of sort of melancholy or nostalgia for a sort of modernization that's sort of happening to this family. The film uses a lot of sort of amazing slow motion. It's a film from sort of two different kinds of slow motion. The slow motion that we see here is just sort of high-speed photography. There's another sort of minor variant of slow motion with step printing, where you actually achieve slow motion by duplicating the individual frame. And then you don't get this kind of smooth slow motion. You get this kind of slowly sort of hesitating, sort of a less smoother motion.
Staggering,
yeah. Kind of it sort of stutters like a record is skipping. Would be a sort of one way of thinking about the effect. And Julie Dash and her husband at the time, Arthur Jaffa, sort of use both of these forms of slow motion. And because they're thinking so much about sort of historical time, they're sort of used for different ways, so that the sort of the smoother kind of slow motion sort of often is in these passages of sort of lyrical action, sort of running on the beach, or a sort of poetic sort of time might be passing, but there's still a lot in this moment that is going to survive. But then there's all these moments of step printing that are kind of hard, they're harder to watch. It looks sort of like a mistake sometimes. And that's associated with a kind of trauma, sort of a more traumatic moments of time. So one of the things in thinking about Julie Dash's film was that because it's a film that's about a sort of seemingly about a sort of lost way of life, that but then it's sort of imagining that this moment in which a sort of way of life might be passing might actually feel like it's going on for a long, long time. And to sort of, and that it's actually not a case where you simply have sort of the modern outside world sort of coming in and a kind of older way of life is simply replaced. That actually what the film is showing is that sort of different ways of registering sort of time sort of work differently, and that this kind of, sort of absolute opposition between sort of Western Standard Time and a kind of sort of oasis sort of outside that time, that's actually sort of more complicated than that, and that you actually see there, and that the film to some extent is also about how the introduction of film itself as a technology that is now sort of very belatedly, sort of 100 years after the invention of film, now sort of capturing a kind of Black experience of passing time from the inside, from in some ways for the first time. Obviously the sort of the long delay for a sort of Black woman filmmaker to be making a kind of Hollywood, sort of a mainstream film. It's one of the first. But then the film itself sort of has scenes where sort of film is coming to the island. A stereoscope viewer, a sort of photographer. It's sort of itself is about how this modern moment is actually arriving. The people in the film, the peasant family, aren't trying to deny modernity or ward it off. It's coming. It just doesn't sort of unfold at the same time that you might think, and that the viewer is now sort of seeing the result of a sort of longer, sort of slower modern moment that actually did start 100 years ago. It just takes time. So it's not this kind of either or. It's not slow or fast. It's sort of both simultaneously.
Thank you. So at the beginning of your section on the literary history of slow motion, you note modernity's slow start by way of Walter Benjamin's description in the Arcades Project of how in 1839, quote, it was considered elegant to take a tortoise out walking, end quote. So can you discuss how you bring this tempo of Flannery in the Arcades to bear upon slow motion as a literary trope and a narrative effect in Faulkner's novels?
Yeah. So in a section, there's a section of the book that sort of looks at basically slow motion as a metaphor for a bunch of writers who are concerned with, again, sort of the passing of time and sort of the speed at which the modern world sort of goes. And one of the central examples is Faulkner. Don DeLillo is another one, some other contemporary writers. But Faulkner, in some ways, is the one I sort of do the most with, particularly late Faulkner. So if there's any real Snopes trilogy fans here, here's some deep cuts just for you. That in the Snopes trilogy, it's sort of later Faulkner. It's kind of not great Faulkner in a way, but he is writing about sort of the long, slow history of capitalist development in the South, as embodied by the Snopes family, this sort of lower middle class, sort of white trash, sort of peasant family that slowly over generations, but actually just in the figure of Flem Snopes in his own lifetime, sort of rises from sort of the horse thief class to the merchant class to the banker class to to sort of full capitalist. And so the story itself, over 3 long novels, it's the same story, and Faulkner just says that he wrote it very slowly. It takes him 20 years to do what he's doing alongside some other things. It actually has several scenes where Faulkner explicitly likens descriptive passages of sort of action or violence to cinematic slow motion. So he is very self-consciously thinking about slow motion as how would you actually write slow motion. But then sort of Flem's antagonist is another Snopes who basically wants to kill. It takes him 30 years to finally kill Flem Snopes. It's this kind of slow burning revenge plot, sort of a kind of white trash Count of Monte Cristo kind of thing, where he's in prison for a while. He's sort of delayed. When he gets out of prison, does he hurry to kill his cousin? No, he walks to Tennessee to get a gun, walks slowly back, this sort of incredibly protracted process. So it's Faulkner, because he's always interested in sort of things that happen slowly. The history of the South. When does the history of sort of racial violence and capitalist exploitation of the South start? Doesn't start with the Civil War. Doesn't start with the 19th century. He's always sort of pushing that start date back to the discovery of America. By the time he's writing these Snopes novels, he's won his Nobel Prize. He's in sort of his high mid-century liberal humanist mode. This is a story as old as mankind. It's almost like that 2001. We're almost a primal history, and so you have so he's thinking about how slowly history has developed in the South, but then how sort of these moments of sort of exaggerated slowness that are themselves sort of the key moments in this history, and then finally the scenes of violence themselves are where, again, it's not sort of great Faulkner, but it's incredibly explicit Faulkner, and basically saying, I'm trying to write in slow motion now, and so making slow motion the kind of the emblem for sort of history itself, but then the only sort of technology by which you can sort of see these moments and sort of understand what's really happening here. It's not just a gunfight between 2 cousins. This is actually sort of the history of the South and its development of 2 forces that have been sort of antagonistic over generations, sort of now trying to which one's going to win.
Great, thank you. If we have time for one more question? Yeah, okay. So as your argument unfolds, slow motion comes into focus as a remarkably flexible special effect for registering so many things. I think one of my favorites was when you said, I think in Peckinpah's films, slow motion is emblematic of end stage masculinity. But you also explained that it is especially used for registering the body in motion, and with it, the perceptual and embodied experience of time. There's just such a broad range of ways that slow motion is doing this in your book. So for example, you analyze these lyrical or monumental, in the case of Leni Riefenstahl, uses of slow motion that eroticize or poeticize or fetishize bodily movements. And in the process, kind of foreground through the camera's optical unconscious, the slowness of human perception, like the fact that we can't see these phases of motion without technology. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you show how slow motion has come to function as a conceptual framework or even an analytical tool for registering the kind of temporal distortions that an individual might experience at a moment of trauma, like a car crash when time sort of slows down. So which forms of slow motion's mediation of the body and time do you think have endured sort of into the 21st century, and why?
I'll try to keep this short because there's a lot. I think in some ways the most, if there's a dominant tradition in slow motion, it is that we're probably not in some ways from the modernist film it really is from sports highlights to Leni Riefenstahl to the Seven Samurai. If I was sort of just doing that to the Seven Samurai, to Bonnie and Clyde, to action cinema, to now kind of post-conglomerate sort of Hollywood global action cinema. So that when I was first working on this book, my little trick was, have I ever seen a movie that cost more than $100 million that didn't have slow motion in it? And I hadn't. I'd have to inflation adjust that now. And I'll remember the one that proved it was, I think it was Alien Prometheus. That I was sort of watching the whole movie, which is clearly expensive, just waiting for the slow motion. Is this gonna be the one? And no, sure enough, there's like a slow motion sequence right at the end. So it's an almost mandatory accessory of a certain sort of level of sort of mainstream action cinema, blockbuster cinema. There are also a lot of, I don't mention this as much in the book, but sort of interesting sort of artists, especially sort of dance film, sort of as a subgenre that is in some ways trying to sort of resist, I think, that kind of fetishistic monumentalization of a certain kind of physical motion that especially when it's used in narrative cinema, when it kind of is captured and now sort of turned into a special effect, loses a certain amount of what that sort of earlier moments of slow motion were maybe trying to sort of remember about the kind of lyricism and sort of the phenomenological experience of being in a body as it moves in time. And then I think a third, one thing that I was realizing both when I was working on this and maybe it was part of the reason I was working on it in the first place, that slow motion is a huge YouTube genre. And so on the one hand, we don't go to the movies anymore and see newsreels that show us, car crashes or we don't, not a lot of us probably watch sort of films sort of testing the tensile strength of metals as they're put in a hydraulic press and seeing when they're going to break. But if you want to watch something like the Slow-Mo Guys channel and you want to see a middle-class British guy try and eat a tablespoon of cinnamon and swallow it, and filmed at about 7,000 frames per second as he then explodes it out. You can do that. And they have hundreds of millions of viewers, and then you sort of once the algorithm starts feeding you this, then you become known. Then YouTube knows you're a slow motion freak, and then you just get more and more and more. And I think that's a sort of it. So it both remembers that whole world of scientific filmmaking and educational film, sort of useful cinema, in a sort of film studies term, that we don't see that much anymore in sort of cinematic contexts. And I think it's also a strange way, again, sort of you're at your computer wasting time watching these people do sort of experiments with time, realizing how much legwork and sort of technological know-how it took for them to make 7 seconds of film about jumping off their roof onto a giant inflatable pool that they've filled with, like, mayonnaise or something like that, so you can see it explode. So it's both sort of remembers this kind of like comic form of slow motion that we don't see as much as the sort of the generic use of it with violence becomes so prominent. And it also just sort of captures all the kind of the documentary slow motion that sort of drops out when narrative film sort of takes hold of it so completely, in the genre. So yeah, so I highly recommend the slow-mo, guys.
And then you realize how much time has passed while you've been watching these
Yeah,
incredibly
yeah,
slow
yeah,
images,
yeah.
like an hour.
Yeah, I've now
You
wasted
thought it was
an
5
hour
minutes.
on slow motion. Yeah.
So should we open this up to questions?
Yeah.
Are there questions?
Okay, so I have a quick question. So I kind of relate to the classical Hollywood slow motion to the movie of like Outside of America. So it reminds me of Clyde's movie Fallen Angel.
Oh, right.
And at the first like 10 minutes or 20 minutes, that they also use the slow motion, but instead of like the slow motion that like spend the time, the character figures have a shadow like leaving behind. It's like a stacking frame inside of that. Is that how slow motion? I would like to hear about your opinion of like that kind of slow motion that the movie try to express, because they also like expand the time but also have the shadow of the lock frame, like the framing stacking.
Oh, right.
So there's like a blur.
Like a blur,
Yeah,
motion
yeah,
blur.
yeah.
Yeah. I've one of the Wong Kar-wai. There's another. Is it Chungking Express where actually there's where he layers different sort of forms of sort of motion. Where actually at one plane of the camera he has Tony Leung. It has the actors actually moving slowly. He kind of tells it almost as a kind of dance, is that they have to move slower so that he can film people walking in front in normal time. And then the effect from Fallen Angels, which I have not seen in a long time. I mean that in some ways, my short version of that answer would be Wong Kar-wai's films, and they're that kind of filmmaking in particular, I'm particularly thinking of him, almost sort of discovers where slow motion could have been in French New Wave filmmaking, for example, trying to kind of reclaim a sort of aesthetic and technological use of slow motion and sort of draw back into a kind of art cinema in a way, to actually give us, which then becomes very much part of that kind of sort of emotional environment that sort of, and then sort of attach it might be the wrong word, but sort of show how slow motion is related to a kind of affect and kind of an emotional character that's not just a kind of technological registering of time. That actually becomes it's trying to kind of humanize it in a way, and so that the sort of the blurring or the staggering or the step printing in some of his films, that's probably where I would start to think about it, sort of to how do you rehumanize something like slow motion 40 years after it's been sort of made so generic in a certain kind of sort of action film, or even just sort of bring it back from its sort of over familiarity. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the talk. So I'm curious about what the status of slow motion is within like early Hollywood film or early continuity cinema, because it seems like that was a technique that was not really employed in, say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it's employed elsewhere, as you said, in educational film and in the films of Riefenstahl and etc. But surely the producers and directors of, say, 1920s Hollywood film must have been aware of the technique as such, right? So, and they must have decided not to employ it if they didn't, right? So what, I was wondering if you've looked into any sort of debates or discourses on this technique from that time. And what I guess the question is, what's the reason for not deciding not to employ this technique in early continuity cinema?
You know, I never found any sort of smoking gun or sort of, you know, high level discussion, sort of filmmaker by filmmaker, what decisions would have been made. It is interesting to think about the few examples that are the exceptions to the rule. There's a Douglas Fairbanks' Thief of Baghdad that has what's supposed to be an underwater action scene where he's fighting a spider. It's in slow motion, and it looks like a slow motion action scene, but even then, the fact that it's underwater, you almost get the sense that there was still a need to think about what sort of narrative motivation would license this departure from standard frame rates. I think maybe one other thing to think about is that this is a period where there's a relatively continuous and even use of fast motion that is very much located in comic genres, you know, Keystone Cops and sort of chase. So you have a kind of departure from reality of action going too fast that's kind of already coded sort of comedically. You know, maybe there's a sense that slow motion is going to cause, you know, is going to see that any departure from standardized frame rates, you know, when they're still relatively new, might actually kind of comically fail. I do think there's other, so that some of the other early Hollywood examples, you see that there has to be some narrative motivation what license it. So, you know, it's a couple dream sequences or a dance number for Fred Astaire. So there are these sort of moments, but they're these little, they're deviations from they're accounted for within a kind of narrative logic, and it's really, you do wait until, yeah, and then a lot of the examples from the 40s and 50s are going to be the same thing, and then I think you do sort of need the combination of the easing of production code, sort of censorship, to allow sort of violence then finally becomes the sort of the micro genre that does not need any sort of explanation or framing within the narrative to sort of show us slow motion. That's sort of, it's self-justifying, but it's really, even though it could have been self-justified, just this sort of monumental action back in the kind of Leni Riefenstahl or sports highlights sense, that sort of, you really have to kind of get ultra violent to now have it sort of produce its own logic in a film. That'd be my sort of answer, and that's why. And then there's only so much you can do with it if you're not going to sort of show the gunshots, you know, have the blood splatter.
Yeah, thank you for this. This question is about sound. So I think I'm thinking about just like when you slow down like a video clip, the diegetic sound, and I mean it just sounds awful. Like I think it's kind of antagonistic to the effect of slow motion, like without any editing. So I guess I'm kind of wondering whether you talk or how you talk about sound, and then also with slowed down music. I don't know, that registers a different. I guess there's a couple ways. There's the idea that slowed down music, you know, if you slow it down and reverse it, the devil speaks to you or something like this. Then there's also remixes where slowed down music is supposed to register precisely a different kind of experience. Maybe not traumatic, but just something else. I think nostalgic is a good word that you use also. But yeah, sound.
Yeah, the French film theorist and sound critic Michel Jean has a very powerful answer that I basically just adopted in some ways, that these, even without talking about slow motion, he was talking about films of the 1960s that he calls a kind of monumental cinema, where you have these kind of set pieces. You're thinking of Leone and you know, Kubrick would be another one where when you have slow motion, but you can't have diegetic sound with it, but you have sort of sound effects or these sort of big moments on the soundtrack. So that for Shion, he was saying these almost kind of recover the sort of early cinema, you know, almost a kind of cinema of attractions moment before you had to kind of have diegetic sound sort of link everything together. So that so a lot of slow motion sequences, you can't have diegetic sound because the sound goes as slow as the screen. It's not going to be monumental or traumatic. It's going to sound sort of, you know, if you heard more yeah, it would lose its effect. But you don't have a gunshot, and you know, do you actually count? Are the gunshots linked? They're not diegetic, they're just sound. The examples where you have sort of slow sound on screen tend to be comic, just because I'm teaching it on Thursday, Singing the Rain, when the film goes out of sync and sort of it slows down. It sort of it sort of gives up the trick in a different way, and so it's coded differently. The other way, but in some ways, the most interesting slow motion sound, at least in the sort of context of the book, is actually in 2001. You'll remember when Dave is sort of slowly murdering Hal, is pulling out his memory chips, and he's singing, you know, Daisy, Daisy. It gets slower and slower and slower. Kubrick, basically, to get that effect, this is just a pure Hollywood production gossip. He had the actor Douglas Rains sort of sing the song Daisy sort of twice as fast, 4 times as fast, 8 times as fast, exactly the way high speed. So because they couldn't quite pitch shift in the way now it would just be sort of digitally. So he actually had to have him sort of sing it faster so he could then sort of slow it down and get that sort of slowness and still have it sort of in the rest. So but that took like an extra, but trying to sync sort of slow sound with slow motion. I think you need that kind of separation of channels to sort of emphasize the kind of the visual effect and sort of the away from the sound that if you just had the sort of sound going with it, it's often comic or it makes it seem it seems artificial in a way. Whereas again, but even in a relatively, you know, first example of slow motion, I don't think it's naturalized from the beginning. And I think sound sort of pushes up against that in different ways.
It kind of calls attention to the technology.
Yeah, it calls attention to technology.
I think Wei Hong had a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very different from what I had expected. I didn't notice it was focusing on slow motion, the kind of history of that technique. I was originally thinking, oh, you talk about Downtime, the kind of slow movement, the culture movement, but also cinema.
Right.
The film study.
Right.
In a good guy tracking game, basically there's a cigarette that was lit, and you can predict that the long as long as the cigarette is lit. And then there's a series of short films.
Right.
That is continuous. So basically, Townsend would be dressing with red road, monk road, the water is extremely away. And I just wonder how to think about like your choice, why you choose to talk about the other districts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do talk about Goodbye Dragon a little bit, and I've sort of used the Walker films as sort of foils or setups for some of this. And one of I kind of am interested in how just film of someone moving slowly, which at some level is slow motion, and how that is sort of like slow motion. You know, whether there is just sort of one slow motion And you can achieve it technologically, you can achieve it through higher frame rates, or you can tell an actor to walk punishingly slow. I think part of the reason that I sort of use when I mentioned those films, I just maybe glance at them, was that sort of became more interested in how slow motion, the examples that highlight that tension between slowness and speed in particular, that are either sort of somehow sort of making visible the kind of technological manipulations of speed that sort of produce, or, sort of supernatural slowness, or films that are themselves in different ways thinking about sort of fast and slow, where slow motion sort of plays a part. And a lot of Lang's films definitely do that. But I think within that sort of genre of slow cinema, I was sort of drawn to thinking about the ways in which, can we use that term, maybe not to sort of explore slowness within them, but can we think about something like a Sergio Leone film as slow cinema? Not much happens, super long takes, a lot of sort of blank, opaque psychology, a lot of dudes doing the same thing for a long time, so that maybe we can sort of think about an alternative sort of emergence for that kind of slow cinema. Although that's definitely one of the sort of contemporary moments in the early 21st century, right? The sort of the prominence of slow cinema, particularly in that kind of global art cinema sort of modes of experimenting with time. It's definitely one of the primary sort of inspirations that I was thinking about. I just never kind of got back to there once I started working my way through the 60s.
I think we're out of time. Thanks so much, Mark.
No, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.